welcome to another episode of Podcast.init. We are recording today on April 21st, 2015. We have Tobias Macy and Chris Patty as your hosts, and today we're interviewing Reuven Lerner.
So Reuven, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So, my name's Reuven. I've been a software developer now for, more than 20 years. Over the last few years, I've been doing, I would say, less and less project and development work and more training to such a degree that now I would say a good 90% of my work is doing training, and a huge proportion of that training is in Python. But, aside from that, I grew up, as you can hear, in the U.S. I went to high school and college there. I've lived in Israel, though, halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in a city called Modi'in, since 99.
That's very cool. Israel seems, from everything that I've heard, like a really neat place to live. It's such an interesting confluence of cultures, and obviously it's in a really sort of interesting, for better or for worse, region. What brought you there? How did you end up deciding to move there?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. How long do we have? Look, I would say, to sort of put it in a nutshell, it's this way. I went to Jewish schools and Jewish camps, and the basic sort of history lesson that we got there was Jews have wanted to live in Israel for 2,000 years. Wouldn't it be great if we could go back? And I sort of looked around and said, actually, guys, we can. We have a country again. You might not have noticed. And and the fact that as someone in the high-tech world, I could make a decent living here just made it a more compelling case. So I came here. My plan was basically to come to Israel as soon after college as possible. And about 2.5 years after graduating, I paid off my loans. And through a lot of frugal living, I moved to Israel. And I must say, I've been very, very pleased here on all fronts. I mean, I'm not going to claim that there are no problems in Israel, but I feel like, far from it, but I feel like these are at least sort of the sorts of problems that I want to wrestle with on a sort of personal, national basis. And we lived in Chicago for 4 years while I was doing my PhD coursework at Northwestern. And much as I enjoyed Chicago, I really enjoyed Chicago, much as I enjoyed living back in the U.S. for a little while, that only cemented my feelings that the U.S. is a nice place, so I hear, but I actually am very comfortable with my decision to move to Israel.
Very cool.
So, how did you get introduced to Python? When did you first come across it, and what made you want to stick with it?
I've been thinking about this, actually. I'm not 100% sure when it was. So I'll give you a little background. So I went to MIT undergrad, and you have to do an undergraduate thesis when you're there. And I did something, this was just before the web started. My undergrad thesis was this new idea that you could have one program that spoke many different protocols. And it really barely kind of worked, but that's okay. It was an undergrad thesis. But in order to get that going, I went to a local bookstore, and I bought 2 books. One was on Sed and Awk, and another was on Perl. And so I was sort of really getting into Perl, and I did all sorts of stuff with Perl. And I knew at that point, this was in the early 90s, there was a lot of rivalry between the Perl world and the Python world. And it just sort of out of necessity and out of interest, I started learning about Python as well. And I still sort of saw myself as more of a Perl guy. And then sort of Perl committed suicide. And so I said, well, Python is actually doing pretty great. Maybe I can do some stuff there. And so it's probably been a good, certainly more than 15 years. I would say it's about 20 years at this point that I've been using Python on a regular basis, sometimes more regular than others. So there was a period when I did tons of work in Python. There's a period of time when I did tons of work in Ruby. I would say over the last 5-6 years, as I've been getting more and more into doing training, the demand for Python training has been so extensive that many of the people who know me for doing Ruby are sort of surprised at how strong I am in Python. But I see actually the community and the language and the business opportunities, quite frankly, just growing and growing in Python, which is not as true for Ruby, I'd say, for now.
Yeah, I definitely agree, actually. I think that while Ruby is thriving in its niches in terms of Ruby on Rails and also in infrastructure as code with Chef, I think Python is definitely gaining ground in terms of its being used in so many more diverse contexts, like in the sciences, and obviously there's quite a bit of web programming being done with it, but also it's also doing infrastructure as code with Ansible and Salt. It's being embedded into 1,000 different projects, and and people are just recognizing that it's a really sort of good general purpose language that's easy to learn and has a great deal of depth for you to grow into as you learn it more fully. So I definitely agree.
Absolutely. I'll say along those lines, by the way, that when I started doing training in Python, teaching classes, I was convinced that all of my students would be web people. So I was like, well, that's what I do with it, right? So that's what everyone must be doing with it. And I could not have been further from the truth. The overwhelming majority of people who are doing who are in my training are in automation, they're in testing, they're in big data analysis, all sorts of fields which, as you said now, like are just growing in the Python space and are helping the language to really extend its tentacles, for lack of a better term, into all sorts of new areas that I never would have imagined, and quite frankly that I'd never really learned about before I was forced to teach it and deal with these people.
Right. That's great. That kind of dovetails with our next question. How did you break into the field of providing Python trainings? How did you sort of get your start and make a name for yourself and have people beating down your door?
Yeah, it's kind of wild. So I've been doing training. So basically, so I moved to Israel in '95, so it's 20 years ago, and I already had consulting work from my previous employer in the U.S., Time Warner. And we had a fantastic relationship. I still have a good relationship with many of the people I knew from there. And so I arrived doing Perl and Linux, and I was doing all sorts of stuff in those fields. And people said to me, well, it's nice that you're doing the development. Would you mind giving us some training in this? And so I had my toes in the training water for a while. And I did a little Python training as well here and there, but not that much. But the real sort of Python training tsunami happened probably about 6 years ago. I was still working on my dissertation. I really didn't want to have to deal with the training marketing. And I figured if I hitched my wagon to a bigger horse, as it were, a cart to a bigger wagon, I don't know what the metaphor is. In any event, then maybe I could finish my dissertation faster and reach some new clients. And so I spoke with a company called John Bryce, which is sort of the 900-pound gorilla of training in Israel. And I said I'd like to do Ruby on Rails training. And they said, yeah, this Ruby thing, it's kind of a flash in the pan. We don't think there's really room for training in it, but send us your resume. And within hours, they called me and they said, oh my God, you know how to do Python. We must have you do Python training. And since then, I've been doing between 2 and 3 courses a month, almost nonstop. And right now, we're recording this in late April, and I'm almost solidly booked through the end of December with training. It's just nuts. And I love it. It energizes me. Today. So I slept 4 hours last night because I was trying to get an article done for Linux Journal. I taught for 8 hours today, came home, finished the article, just did our podcast, talking to you guys. And I'm a zombie. And truth be told, when I'm training, it gives me such energy. I love it. I love the questions people have. I love interacting with them. And I love seeing those aha moments or oh my God moments. Like, you can do all that in 1 or 2 lines. And of course, the point in Python is, yes, you can, and you can read it 6 months later, which was not necessarily true for Perl, or I would say even sometimes for Ruby.
Right.
So training was sort of an offshoot of my interactions with John Bryce, and recently I decided to sort of, now that I've finished the dissertation, finished the PhD, I've returned to doing training on my own through my own company directly, and that has just increased the demand even more, much to my pleasant surprise.
Great. Yeah, it's interesting to hear from the perspective of somebody providing training how much of a demand there really is for Python, because you see all these different reports that come out about the comparative popularity of various programming languages, and they all can be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, but having that type of perspective on which languages are actually in demand by larger companies is really interesting, particularly since you were saying how a number of them were really terribly interested in Ruby on Rails, but they really want to learn about Python, so it's good to hear.
Oh, for sure. So, and I'll tell you, first of all, I think someone in each of these big multinational companies, and I mean, companies I train for, like I do training in Cisco, HP, VMware, EMC, these big SanDisk, these big companies, where someone I think at the top basically said, we have to do some standardization. We have to choose a smaller subset of languages to work with, and Python is good for a lot of people, and so let's just run with it.
Yep.
And so everything from internal web apps to big data to testing and everything, they're doing a lot of standardization on Python. And not only are they doing this in a lot of companies, but the demand is almost insatiable. It turns out that when I'm, say, at Cisco giving training, I'll often meet someone else, new person, I'll say, "Oh, what are you doing here?" "Oh, I'm giving Python training." Like we're both there on the same day, and then really the demand is almost insatiable. And I would say it's going to grow before it shrinks, in part because such a huge number of universities are now teaching Python as an intro language.
Yep,
And
right.
you know that some ridiculously large proportion of those students are going to finish school, graduate from college, go off and do startups, and what language are they going to use? Well, clearly it's going to be Python because that's the one they know best.
Yep.
And so we're going to see another 5 to 10 years, I think, of this, at least.
And unlike Lisp or Scheme, which used to be the kind of de facto standard for intro courses in at least the big hardcore CS schools, or Java, I guess, Java, certainly had commercial use, but Lisp or Scheme was really kind of, certainly there have been successful commercial enterprises conducted with it, but it's not exactly what you consider a mainstream language. And I just want to say one thing about those language popularity polls that we see. So many times when you actually look at what metric those polls use for like how they determine which language is most popular, it's something really stupid and flawed, quite honestly. Like it's like number of lines committed to GitHub projects over the last 6 months. And I mean, like that's
Java will win.
Exactly. Like that's certainly, or these days JavaScript, that certainly represents a certain subset of the computing populace, but by no means is it like comprehensively showing what languages are actually most popular in use out in the world.
Well, it's funny, by the way, that you mentioned Lisp and Scheme. So, like, as I said, I went to MIT, and so I was brainwashed into believing that Lisp is the best language ever, and I continue to believe that. And it actually sort of hurt me inside a bit when they said they were moving away from Scheme toward Python. And the argument they used was basically, the intro course has changed because computing has changed and what we want to teach our students has changed. And we can get those ideas across better with Python than with Lisp. I'm not 100% sure that I agree with that, because I really do think that there are many things I learned, both in that course and from Lisp in general, that have been so useful. I didn't recognize it at the time, of course. At the age of 18, you don't recognize anything. But years later, I'm like, wow, that was such a useful insight that has carried me through, and I use some of those things in my teaching even nowadays. So I still think people should learn Lisp, but it is pretty great that they can indeed use a practical language that has theoretical depth in an intro CS course.
So out of curiosity, when you're performing these Python trainings at these big companies, is there a particular language that most of your students are coming from, or is it just sort of a mishmash of various languages that they've all used before?
Well, look, most of my training is in Israel, and Israel has a very strong .NET Microsoft focus. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the companies I deal with are hardware companies, which means they have a C and a C++ focus. And so the sort of more, high-level programmers among them are the people who've been doing Java, or I guess like C#. So it's rare. It happens, I would say maybe 10%, 20% of my students have a background in Ruby, JavaScript, some sort of high-level language that I think gives them a closer insight into how Python works. So for a lot of them, this whole idea, like I always have to tell them that you're learning not just the language, but the approach, that there's no such thing here as a compiler. Yep. So you can't just write the file, throw it to the compiler, hope that your errors will be found. You actually have to think a bit, and you have to run it, and you have to work with the interactive shell, with IPython, so that you can test your things and do it iteratively.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely very much two different things of learning a language and what it is and what the semantics are versus learning how to use the language in an idiomatic manner. So.
Right, and I would say that over the years I've been learning what the idioms are that surprise people or that are most useful to them, and I've tried more and more to gear my training in that direction. For instance, I used to almost never talk about scope. It was like scoping in Python, it's so obvious. Until I discovered it's not. It's not to people who are not used to it. And so now I have a long section where I talk about scoping with people, and I explain to them different kinds of variables and LEGB and how this works, and the sort of fun tricks you can play with that as well. And I think that those insights, maybe they're not going to be redefining true to false and false to true in their day-to-day work. I certainly hope not, although I do suggest that they do it to someone they don't like when they go to get a cup of coffee. But understanding LEGB can really give you deep insights into how the language works and what's going wrong when you're trying something.
Right, I'm sure. And speaking to your point about what's idiomatic in different languages, I was a Ruby guy for years and years and years, and I've only been kind of a Python convert, although I still love Ruby, for the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 months or so. And that was one of the most challenging aspects of learning Python for me, is so many of the concepts are very similar, but the idioms are so different. And in kind of, if you're coming from a different environment where you're used to different things, unintuitive ways, like the, no implicit return thing. I know it's a small thing, and most Pythonistas are like, well, why would you do it any other way? But when you're used to Ruby, where implicit return happens, it can, lead to some hair pulling and like, why won't it just work? Moments until
That
you
actually
figure it
drives
out
me
and someone
crazy.
tells you. Yeah.
That actually, I must say, that drives me totally bonkers. And maybe it's just my, Lisp, Ruby, even Perl persona coming out. But, come on. Can't we just have implicit return? And I understand, no, everything has to be explicit. But I really actually do miss that. And they're very, also the whole thing where when you do assignment, or I would say even you're sorting a list, where it returns none. I love getting things back and then being able to chain them. And yes, we've sorted and so forth. But, I don't know, that's behavior that I just sort of shrug my shoulders at and say, well, as I tell my classes, I say, well, they never called me to ask what I thought. So...
That's both the blessing and the curse of having a benevolent dictator for life, right? Is unfortunately everybody has an opinion, but his is the only one that really matters.
Yes, precisely.
So, what are some of the biggest obstacles that people encounter? Speaking of idioms and idiomatic code, what are some of the biggest obstacles that people encounter when they're learning Python?
Ooh, good question. So first of all, the whole dynamic typing thing, I think, really takes them by surprise and sort of gives them the chills. So I guess yesterday and today I gave the first day of an intro Python course to a company here in Israel. And both days, I think because people were coming from these statically compiled languages, both days I have this, one of the exercises they give them is just sort of a number guessing game. So get raw input from the user, and we're almost always using Python 2.7. And so, raw input, get a string, and now compare it with the randomly generated number from the random module. And I do this on purpose because I know they're going to get tripped up, and they're going to remember the hard way that raw input always returns a string. And so someone said, so why don't we just declare the variable to be an integer, and then automatically raw input, when it's assigned to that variable, it'll become an integer. I was like, no, that's not the way it works. You can't have a variable that's a certain type. And so the fact that variables aren't typed, the fact that parameters, which are variables, aren't typed, just gives them the willies. Similarly, I think, you know what's hard for them also? The whole splat argument thing, that and keyword arguments.
Yep.
They think it's super cool, and they cannot wrap their heads around it. Either it's hard for them, or they don't know why they would want it.
I'll totally admit that I totally love it. I think it's a great feature, but I have to admit that I find it hard to wrap my head around sometimes. And whenever I see it in code, I have to be like, "What's this doing again? What do you want?" So it's definitely, I can definitely appreciate that it's one of those. I mean, and for you, or for someone who comes from a language like Lisp, it's like, well, of course you have dynamic arguments. Like, why would you want to do it any other way? So it's a great feature, but it can when you first encounter it, or even after you first encounter it, it can feel kind of alien.
Yeah, it definitely took a little while for that to sink in for me when I first started using Python.
Yeah, and so one of the exercises that I give is to have an XML generator in a function. And so I say, so the tag name should be the first parameter, and the content should be the second parameter, and then you can take any number of keyword arguments. And those are turned into attributes inside the opening tag. And that usually confuses them because they say, wait a second, where am I supposed to use the splat? Where am I supposed to get any number of arguments? It takes them a while to realize, well, first of all, just because you've learned about a tool doesn't mean you have to use it. But second of all, in that particular case, getting a default argument is typically more appropriate and more useful than having the splat there, splat args. Yep. But the keyword arguments, well, that's just super handy. And then you can have this API that looks nice and does something spiffy behind the scenes. What are other things that drive them nuts? Oh, I know. The fact that objects are totally exposed and open. right? Like, so I even go through the motions of, okay, here's our person object. Let's create a getter and a setter. And I'm like, no, do not use these. Erase these getters and setters. We don't need them. And people will say, but, we're supposed to have, objects are supposed to be black boxes. And I say, well, not really in Python.
Yep.
But, what if we want to have programmatic access or change the API over time, evolve it? Wouldn't that be better to have in a getter or setter? I say, well, actually, the way Python approaches this is a property. And typically, my intro classes don't even get to properties.
Yep.
Depends on how the class is structured, but usually not. But I say, like, Python does have answers to these things, but they're different than the answers that you're used to. And just because the object system doesn't work, or just because the approach isn't what you're used to, doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it different, and it's a different set of trade-offs.
That's really interesting that you say that. Properties are one of the things that I kind of like. As I admitted already, I'm kind of a Python noob still. I've been using it for a few months, and I can certainly tootle along and write my code day to day in it. But there are various aspects of it that I haven't quite wrapped my head around yet, and that leads me to wonder. Many languages, like, there's almost nothing new under the sun in computer science, right? Like, every language can trace various of its features back to some lineage of somewhere else. Where does Python's object system come from? Like, that aspect of properties and objects working differently than you would see, where do you think it drew its object-oriented inspiration from?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I've always said and thought, and I think it's even true, that a lot of the Python object system came from Smalltalk. So you can, you came from Ruby, you've spent some time in Ruby. Like, truth be told, if I have to teach Ruby and I have to teach Python, I often will come up with a new exercise in one language and use it in the other, because the languages are, under the surface, very similar in some ways. And the object system is very similar in some ways, except Python somewhere said, no. Instead of doing everything through messages, everything through methods, we're going to turn that around, and we're going to make everything look like data access. And so, like, properties are basically the inverse of Ruby's attributes. Where Ruby attributes, we make data look like methods, right? And right. In Python, we make our methods look like data. And I've got to assume that it was Guido or someone else, or maybe one of the languages that he learned, that he just really liked that approach. And it definitely is a bit of a bastardization or like a real revolution from what Smalltalk did. And I don't know. It's an interesting approach. There's sometimes when I sort of roll my eyes and say, really, we have to do it this way? But the whole object system, basically, if you understand how attributes work, then you understand the whole darn object system, and inheritance, for instance, just comes straight out of that. Mm-hmm. There's no special rule for inheritance. It's just an extension of, or a special case of attribute lookup. And that, I think, is really elegant. But where did it come from exactly? I don't know. That's a good question. I'd love to find out.
Maybe one of our listeners can tell us if there's got to be some language history buffs out there who can school us on this.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure another thing that people, particularly coming from things like C++ or Java, have trouble with is the lack of protected and private methods in Python.
Oh my God, they go nuts over that. Right. And I mean, right, because they sort of wonder, how is this possible? How can this language, so it has dynamic typing, everything is open, nothing is private or protected, and especially, like, many of the people whom I teach are in the security industry. And to them, this whole notion of, well, we're just going to be really optimistic and nice and friendly, and everything will work great. And they say, are you kidding me? That's like, antithetical to everything we do professionally. Yep. And I say, well, maybe, but it's worked pretty well for 2 decades, Right.
And interestingly, too, Python is actually quite popular in the security industry as well.
Right. So I don't know. It's very, I can't explain it. I do tell them that if you really want, there's always a way around it. Mm-hmm. But if you really want sort of extra security or to pretend that things are private or protected, you can always, use something like a descriptor. Mm-hmm. But truth be told, how many people are going to do that? Almost none. I don't know how, I'm sure we're going to hear from people now, right? But like, how often do people really use descriptors after all? They're super cool, but I think it's, maybe 5% of the population. And that 5% might need it.
Yep.
but I think it's a relative rarity.
Once again, I think it comes down to just having to think about different ways of structuring your systems and your code, right, around this new model, this new way of working. I'm sure it's just a matter of getting people to change their mind about things is the hard part.
Yes. Yes. Oh, here's another thing that people are surprised by and sort of intrigued by, which is, of course, comprehensions, lists comprehensions, set comprehensions, and dictionary comprehensions, where they see it as almost like black magic. And they see, so I give lots of examples of what we can do. We usually, depending on the length of the course, the type of the course, we then practice it to some degree or another. But I know that people don't get it. Like, they don't see the sort of, okay, I have a problem, a comprehension is my solution, and this is what I'm going to get back. I think part of it is just sort of years of training, where if you work with functional languages, or if you use these sorts of tools like map and reduce and filter for years, then you just sort of see those as solutions to a huge variety of problems. But for a lot of people, all they see is this wacky syntax, and they're not quite sure what they're doing or how they're getting it, but they're getting results back that don't quite make sense.
Yeah, I was going to say that for me, list comprehensions and comprehensions in general are one of the Python features that I find myself struggling with, not because I can't understand them when someone else uses them and I see them in source code and I say, comprehension, it does this and thus, but because the syntax is so alien to me that when I find I need to do something and I'll, hit a code review and they'll say, well, gee, a comprehension could do this a lot more cleanly and elegantly. And it's like, oh, yeah, I never would have thought of that, because it's just this, for me, in my, really limited way of thinking, it's just this bizarro world thing off in a corner somewhere that I haven't quite embraced yet. And I can only imagine other newbies have a similar challenge with them.
Yeah, for sure. I often tell my students in Israel that we have an advantage because it helps to read a list comprehension from right to left. Actually, just recently, like a week or two ago, I've got to write this up in a blog post, but I think that it can help to think of a list comprehension or any comprehension in terms of SQL, because a lot of people know SQL. And if you think of, and I've also started writing my comprehensions in 3 lines, breaking it up. So you've got the expression you get back, and then you've got the source that you're iterating over, and then you've got your if statement option. And I realized that if you sort of make that analogous to SQL, it's like a select call. Right, you've got your select from some source, where, and you're filtering it out. And once I made that analogy for people, like really just in the last few weeks I sort of came up with this, that I think helped to solidify their understanding of the syntax. It's still a little weird for them, but at least it sort of became closer to something they're familiar with.
No, I totally agree. I think that's actually quite brilliant, because years and years ago I worked for I worked for a couple of years in the financial service industry, and my boss at the time was one of these brilliant SQL hackers. Just like he said, SQL is like Go. You can learn the rules in 5 minutes, but it can take years and years to really appreciate all the strategies involved. And he actually taught me a way of structuring SQL, query statements in exactly the same format that you're kind of talking about, like this really rigid format with the select part of the clause up top, and then, from is in the next line, and where is in the line after that. And it's this really sort of like almost visual way of representing the syntax, right? So as opposed to this big, long, globby thing, like it kind of, the format that you use shows you what the code is trying to do by virtue of the way it's laid out. And it sounds like this way that you're talking about of laying out list comprehensions does the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Now I definitely have to write this up at some point.
Yeah, you do, because I want to read it.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting metaphor. It's thinking about it, it's very intuitive when you approach it in that manner. So, yeah, that's great. So, another question we have is, how does teaching Python differ from teaching other languages? So, are there different approaches that you would take for when you're teaching a Python course versus, say, a Ruby or a Perl course?
So, first of all, like the Ruby and Python courses I teach, at least the language parts, like if it's not doing, web stuff or something, quite frankly, I just steal from each language. I really see the languages as sort of similar enough to each other. Obviously, there are differences. Obviously, so here, for instance, when I'm talking about Ruby, I have to talk about blocks. I have to talk basically about functional programming way earlier. So with my Python course, I basically say, listen, folks, this section on functional programming, on comprehensions and passing parameters, which are functions, like, this is the hardest part of the course, and if you don't get it, it's not you. And you don't need it to be a Python programmer. But in Ruby, if you don't get blocks, you're sunk. Mm-hmm. So that's one difference. I'm trying to think what else. I think in Python you can go way, way farther, also without creating classes, right? You don't need to create classes. You don't need to create methods either. And so we can sort of, I spend the first day to day and a half of my Python courses just talking, like, we don't even create functions. We're just using the built-in data structures and methods. And then we do functions. And then we talk about objects at the end. In part because I think it's really important that people get these basics down, in part because you can. Yep. But again, in Ruby, you sort of need to be mixing and matching a lot more to get so that people can get it. Because if you don't know what a class is in Ruby, once again, you're sort of sunk.
I totally agree, and I actually think that that's kind of one of the awkward bits around learning Ruby, because I've certainly encountered quite a number of introduction to Ruby, learning Ruby kind of books where they either show objects right up front or they wait until the very, 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 very end of the book. And in Ruby's case, at least, you get to the end of the book and you get to objects and you're like, well, why didn't you teach me that in chapter 1? Because it would have made a whole lot of things a whole lot clearer and easier. And I can see what you mean, though. Python kind of has a different aspect to its soul, in that you really don't need to use objects for a significant amount of great procedural coding with some really deep useful data structures. You really don't need to use objects unless the problem domain really calls for it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Guido even had some sort of blog post, I think about a year ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago at this point, where he was asked, how do I make my Python programs faster? And my guess is he's asked this so often that he finally just got sick of it. He said, okay, folks, I'm going to write down my notes. And one of the first things he wrote was, don't use objects. Just use the built-in data structures. They're fast, they work, they're intuitive, they've been really highly refined and optimized over the years. And why not? And that's something else that people sort of need to shed, that if you're coming from, say, the Java or the C# world, someone wants to write hello world, their first instinct is, ooh, got to write a class. And in Python we say, no, slow down. What problem are you trying to solve? And what the analogy I often use is, you want to have a toolbox and then pick the right tool out of the toolbox, not just pick the first thing that comes to mind.
Right, absolutely. And it also strikes me listening to you that languages like Clojure, for instance, which is enjoying quite a burst in popularity lately, it doesn't have objects either, and people are just using the data structures that it pretty much provides and using those as building blocks. And obviously, people are doing some pretty amazing, pretty complex things, once again without objects. So it's just a matter of sort of breaking out of your usual mode of thought and embracing a completely different model for doing your work. Actually, thank you. You've inspired a pick that I hadn't thought of previously that I'll put in our picks section.
Oh, good.
So what sorts of materials or medium do you use for training people in Python?
So this has been going through a bit of an evolution over the years, and I'm always looking for new things. So I'm a big Emacs user, right? I went to MIT, went through the brainwashing process. Back when I was there, even the secretaries used Emacs. So, obviously the students were going to use it. And, my .emacs file has been steadily growing over 20 plus years. Every so often I prune it. Every so often I say, really, what's this doing in here? But I use that. And I tell my students, you don't have to use Emacs, right? There are some weird people who don't, so I'm told. Sickos, that's what I call them. I actually tell my students they should use PyCharm just because they need something that's a little shallower learning curve. So I use Emacs, and then I used to use just the regular old Python shell. And someone said to me, why aren't you using IPython? I said, oh yeah, I've heard of it. I'll try it. And of course I tried. I said, oh my God, this is so much better. But I could not use IPython Notebook just because I do a lot of my examples, a lot of my demos are with files.
Oh,
and then
yeah.
At some point, I don't know exactly when, but at some point the IPython Notebook let you do files. And I said, oh wow, that's amazing. And so literally a month or two ago, I switched to doing all of my live coding demos, and I have a lot of them. when I'm teaching, because if people ask me a question, I want them also to get the feeling that if they have a question when they're working, they should turn to IPython and they should try it. What happens if the only answer to that is, let me try? Not, oh boy, I should look it up. Looking it up is not bad, but that's why you have this beautiful sandbox of the interactive, the REPL. So I've lately, over the last month or two, I've been using IPython Notebook, and then my standard thing at the end of each day is people send me email who are in my class, and I send them a zip file with all the exercises to this, like basically solutions that I solved in front of them of the exercises, plus the slides in PDF, plus now I can send them the IPython Notebook, and they can then replay everything that I demoed to them in the lecture. So IPython Notebook has become like an essential part of my teaching as well. A third thing is the Python Tutor. I don't know if you're familiar with the Python Tutor site. PythonTutor.com. Oh my God, it's amazing. It's amazing. I forget the name of the person who did it. It's beautiful and fantastic. The number of occasions in which someone says, yeah, but why? So for instance, I have an example I often use where I create a small list. My list equals ABC. And then I create a larger list, like big list equals my list, my list, my list. So now we have 4 names for this same list. And I show them that if you change index 00 of the big list, you're really changing the original my list as well. At this point, people's noses sort of wrinkle, and they are kind of wondering what's going on. And I pulled the Python Tutor, which has a dynamically generated graphical display of the innards of your Python program. And they can see the arrows, they can see the boxes, and it just becomes instantly clear.
Wow, that's really awesome. I did not know about that, and I will definitely plan some quality time to go play with that, because as I said, there are definitely a few Python concepts that I could use some brushing up with, and that sounds like a really useful tool. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sure.
I've come across it before, but it's been a while since I've had call to use it, so definitely thank you for the reminder. So I understand that you recently wrote a book called Practice Make Python, if I'm correct? And
Yes.
I'm just wondering if that's something that you generally use as a follow-up reference for your trainings.
So it was basically suggested by my students. I think it was about a year ago, a little less than a year ago. Over the course of 2 weeks, after every class or during the breaks, people would say to me, okay, listen, we're taking a 4-day course. That's great. But there's always going to be this gap between finishing the course and then wanting to use the information in our actual work. Where can we go to get exercises? I said, well, there's Zed Shaw's Learn Python the Hard Way. And they said, yeah, we've done that. Okay, next. I said, I don't know, but it sounds like a business opportunity. So basically, I said, I asked them, what would happen if I gave you a book or sold you a book with 50 exercises that would force you to really think in Python? And then you would have to work at it, but it would probably give you some benefit. And they all said, oh my God, I would definitely get that. Now, they're all liars because they didn't all get that, but I will hunt them down. But basically what I did was I wrote up 50 of the exercises that I most like using in my courses, either as demos or as exercises, that I see give people that aha moment, that they're forced to work. And sometimes the solution is as little as 1 or 2 lines. But getting to those 1 or 2 lines is the magic and is where the learning really comes from. And so I wrapped up the book. I guess I finished writing it about, I don't know, probably January, February. And I've been very slowly but surely making videos to accompany it for people who want that package. But that's just time consuming, and I'm so busy with other things, it's taking way longer than I would like. But the book is not a tutorial, because I really think that there are enough tutorials out there in Python.
Absolutely.
The world doesn't need another tutorial. The world needs something for after you're done with the tutorial. And so what I call my book is, it's like your second Python book, or it's the book to read after you've taken a course.
That's really awesome, because I'm definitely in that category of, I've read some of the tutorials, I read, Dive into Python, and as I say, I've been using it at work now for 4 or 5 months, and so I'm definitely past the intro phase, but I'm not really to the point where, when you're in that kind of tentative stage where you're not quite comfortable with every aspect of it, and it's not like, it doesn't feel like that really well-used tool that just sort of fits in your hand like it was meant to always be there. I'm not there yet, and I think something like this book could be incredibly useful to get me there.
Good, I hope so. And I've been very fortunate also. A lot of people who have read it have emailed me with corrections or suggestions or insights. And I like that. And I mean, also when I'm teaching, like from my perspective, what's most important, both from my perspective as a teacher, but also for the learning process, is the interactions. It's the asking questions, it's the wrestling with things, it's the talking it through. So fortunately in Israel, people are not bashful, and they are more than happy to say, that's stupid, or that's a terrible idea, or what do you think about this, and really challenge me. But I really think that helps with the learning. And so I've also been learning from the people who've written the book and sending me all suggestions. And so if anyone out there gets the book and has ideas, suggestions, improvements, that would be fantastic. I mean, I would say easily half or more, probably even 2/3 of the exercises were either inspired by or improved on by students in my classes who gave me feedback and really helped me to refine them.
That's very cool. And speaking of getting the book, Reuven has very kindly offered a discount code, which we'll be passing on to our listeners. You can find it in the show notes rather than us trying to say it and having it come across garbled or anything. We'll just put a link to the book and the awesome discount code there for in case you want to avail yourself of this resource. So in your freelance work, what portion of your projects use Python?
Interesting you should say that. So that's, of course, the question. So for years, actually, it was kind of embarrassing that I was doing most of my freelance work in Ruby and most of my training in Python. And obviously, I was using Python in all sorts of different ways, but it was sort of like this, Bruce Wayne Batman kind of thing, I guess. I'm not sure which Python fits into, so I'll let you guys figure out the analogy where. I've always had some clients who use Python, sometimes more, sometimes less. There have always been some people using it for whether it's database work or web stuff. And certainly I've always done some projects on my own with it. But truth be told, it's really only since I've started getting heavily into the training that I've been diving myself into Python and using it for more and more things and trying to find sort of the corners of different stuff. So recently I've been asked to do more and more training using NumPy, SciPy, big data types of things. So there, I've started just sort of doing it on my own. But the number of actual paid projects I've done actually, that's not true. In the last 5 years, the number of paid projects I've done in Python, I would guess it's about 10%, 20% at most. There was a period, maybe 10 years ago, when all of it was in Python. I did some stuff on the web with Zoe. I did some stuff just with databases, with Postgres, with all sorts of analysis. So it sort of comes and goes. And I think this is one of those periods now where it's what's coming. Like, I think it's safe to say that over the next year, probably the overwhelming majority of my project work will be in Python.
Listen, as far as, you mentioned you're embarrassed to say or whatever, don't be. As far as I'm concerned, it's tool to task, right? Like, I mean, if your clients are willing to pay you and they want Ruby and that's the kind of work that you want to be doing or need to be doing, then by all means use Ruby. As far as I'm concerned, I love Python. I think it's a great language. I love Ruby. I think it's a great language, but they're just tools. Like, I think this kind of like crazed partisanship is something that we can leave behind. I think especially in the polyglot era that we're kind of entering, so many companies now are, as much as, some are standardizing, a lot are kind of saying like, well, what is Python good for? Let's use it for that. What is, Clojure good for? Let's use it for that, or whatever the case may be. And I think that's an attitude that we should all embrace.
I agree. I wrote this blog post probably like a year or two ago where I said, I made the analogy that Ruby is Oscar and Python is Felix from the Odd.
That is totally apt.
and you can learn from both of them and you can enjoy both of them and each of them has their quirks. But the like knowing both is really where the interesting things happen.
So just wondering if you've seen a change in the demand for Python skills in the time between when you first started using it or using it professionally at least and most recently. Whether that's been up, down, or both.
Up. It's crazy. So, back in the Stone Age, 20 years ago, when I started using Python, when I got to Israel, basically, and I said to people, I do, at that point it was mostly Perl and Linux. People looked at me like I had, fallen off from the moon. Like, Perl? Linux? Open source? What is this thing? Oh yeah, it's that thing that's not Windows. And the fact that only Windows had decent Hebrew support only made it harder for it to break in. But over the years, I've seen a growing interest in Python, and then it was like this explosion about 5 years ago. it's just unbelievable. There's now, as I said, insatiable demand that I even had these guys. I gave a talk about Ruby, I guess about 2 years ago. And there were two people who came there, and afterwards they came up to me and they said, listen, we're not really interested in Ruby. We're really interested in Python. And we're hoping that someone who came to your talk who knows Ruby will be interested in learning Python and working for us because we can't find anyone. Like, the demand is so crazy, they were like poaching people from other languages. And I said, I have bad news for you guys. The only thing rarer in Israel than a Python programmer is a Ruby programmer. So good luck with that approach. But the demand is growing as I think for a variety of reasons. First of all, companies are taking it seriously. They're realizing this is not a toy language. This is a serious language you can use to solve serious business problems. And I mean, what I often tell people is, in the 60s and 70s, what we cared about with programming was that the darn thing worked. If it worked, we were delighted. And the 80s and the 90s, what we cared about was, did it work fast? And nowadays, what we worry about is it maintainable? And does it let my programmers achieve maximum velocity? And so Python just hits the sweet spot on that, because nowadays, people are expensive and computers are cheap. And so if I can get a 10 times or 5 times or even 2 times increase in my programmer productivity, but it means I have to spend 20% more on servers, who cares, right? Like, that's totally worthwhile. And a lot of the companies, I think, have done the math and said, yeah, that's good for us. Why should we spend tons of money? A lot of people come from MATLAB, right? I've been surprised by the number of people I teach who are MATLAB users. Oh, wow. They're like, yeah, we're going to use SciPy NumPy because it's free. And do you know how much it costs to get these libraries in MATLAB? I said, actually, I have no idea. They said, oh, it costs a lot per seat, per year. So it's astonishing. It's astonishing to see the number of companies, people, places that are interested in Python. And really, I think it's just growing.
I bet. And it must be really exciting, actually, for those people moving to Python from MATLAB, because MATLAB's an awesome tool, but with something like Python, you have this incredibly rich ecosystem of not only can you do your numerical analysis, but you can bring in, like, statistics and data analysis with Panda, or like, or image processing with Pill, or one of these other tools. And I mean, you just have this amazing plethora of tools to draw from, and you don't have to think in terms of, well, gee, if I want to use this, I'm going to have to pay another $5,000, or I have no concept as to the amounts involved. Money just isn't an issue because most of them are free. It's got to be incredibly liberating for them.
Right. Right. They no longer have to make decisions on, do we have the budget to use this? Is this the most appropriate tool? And people just like the language. They like it. They like its breadth, they like its depth, they like the community. And you see, in addition to, for all the statistics stuff, just today I had people in my class who are big users of R. Now, I used R in my dissertation analysis. I love R. It's really great. And R's big claim to fame is that it's a statistics language. It's a great language for that. And it has a huge, sort of like, PyPI has a huge number of packages. So R has a similar number of packages in what they call CRAN. Lots of packages for doing statistical analysis. But I see, little by little by little, people are contributing to Python, to SciPy, NumPy, and all those packages. And I think in a few years, we might see Python eating R's lunch in that sense. It can't yet, because it doesn't have the same plethora of modules, but it's getting there for enough people. And then you're going to have another bunch of people who are just like, stoked to use Python and are contributing to the community also. It's almost a matter of increasing returns.
Yeah, I've heard anecdotally about a lot of people moving from R to Python, particularly when they want to productionize what they've been working on. So they may use R for doing the research and development phase of a project, but when they actually need to handle larger volumes of data, they move it over to Python, because my understanding is that when you start loading large data sets into R, it just really starts to slow down. So.
Yeah, that's not the reason my dissertation was so late, but I'm willing to blame that.
That's great. So what kinds of projects might you encounter that would cause you to choose a different programming language from Python?
Good question. Well, first of all, there's just like the fun and experimenting kind of thing, right? Like, so I want to try more closure and play with that, especially its software transactional memory, which I would not be surprised if it ends up in Python at some point in the future, but obviously doesn't exist now, because it just seems like an incredibly cool concept and fun thing to play with. And of course, it's Lisp, so it must be good. Look, if I were writing, and no one should ever trust me if I do write such a thing, right? But if I were writing an operating system, if I were writing a desktop application, one of those things where speed is really crucial, then I think I would choose a real systems programming language. If I were writing something that needed to scale massively, or that really, really, really needed threads that were truly parallel and could not use processes, I would use something else. I still, because I've used Ruby and because I've used Rails and Sinatra for so many years, that's still sort of my first inclination of what to use for web stuff. So my website, for instance, runs in Sinatra. And it's totally great. It works fine for my purposes. If I were doing it from scratch today, would I use Flask maybe? Maybe not. Who knows? But I would say for your average project, like here, for instance, here's a story. So I live in the city of Modi'in, halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And when I got to the city in '99, I started, or I guess I sort of took over an email list for people who live here. 16 years later, we now have 3,000 people on the email list. And it's, a local forum. And I decided a few months ago that it was just not worth my while to run an email server of my own anymore. So I decided to move everyone to Google Groups. Well, Google Groups only lets you, I asked people to move themselves. Half of them did that. So that left me with 1,500 people to move. And Google Groups only lets you add 100 people at a time manually each day. So I was like, well, how can I figure this out? I know, I'll use Python. I know, I'll use sets. And in a few lines of code, basically, I was able to download the list from my old system, download the list from Google Groups, turn each of those using a set comprehension into a set, do set 1 minus set 2, grab 100 people, and there you go. Now I have 100 people I'm going to move today. And so it's those sorts of applications that are just so trivially easy to do in Python that I find it's clear that I would use it for. Yeah. But systems stuff, systems, embedded, web, still for me, I think I would look at other languages first, but that might happen less and less over the coming years. I wouldn't be surprised, in fact.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned Clojure. I know I find that language particularly exciting as well because of the software transactional memory aspect, especially when you start to realize that the way it handles data structures being atomic by default, like threading just becomes, concurrency just becomes such a dramatically easier problem to reason about. I think that is a really cool concept, and that's going to be one of my picks as one of his talks where he discusses some of the aspects of that. It's a really cool talk.
Excellent.
So let's, unless anybody has anything else, let's move on to the picks, shall we? Reuven, why don't you list your picks?
Okay, so I'm going to mention a few things here. First of all, so I run a few different, in addition, in my copious free time, right, to my training and my development work and book writing and whatnot. So I've got this site that I've been running for a few months now. It's about 6 months, called Daily Tech Video. So it's dailytechvideo.com. And the idea is that every day I find a really great conference talk or other video that explains something, typically about software, typically about open source dynamic languages or databases or web stuff. Because, hey, what do you know? I'm interested in open source dynamic languages and databases and web stuff. And I have a little intro and I describe the talk. And that's been going on, as I said, for a while. And so far it's been getting some attention. And I'd be very curious to hear from people what they think. And if there are any talks that they're interested in. Certainly there are plenty of Python talks in there, not surprisingly. Number 2, anyway, I'll just move on to sort of other interesting picks. So I've been, among the places I go to do training is in China. I've been there, I guess, 7 times in the last 3 years. I'm going twice more this year. And I just think it's super fun and super cool. I'm learning Chinese. I just really, really enjoy traveling there. And so part of my obsession has been reading books about China and interesting analyses. And so a book that I read just recently by Evan Osnos, who was the New Yorker's correspondent in China. It's called Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. Brilliantly written, brilliantly reported, fascinating book. Either if you do go to China or if you don't go to China, it's still worth reading about what is really going on there and how is the government trying to influence people, influence policy, and how are people sort of pushing back. And in what ways is it the way we would expect in the West, and in what ways is it not? Peter Hessler, who also wrote some great books, is another good person who wrote about that. I guess my final pick, it's only here once, right? So I've got to give you the whole shebang. It's this book that came out a few years ago, actually. It's called Mindless Eating: Why We Eat More Than We Think. And it's this guy named Brian Wensing, who is a professor of marketing at Cornell. And he has done some of the most brilliant psychology experiments I've ever heard of. Because basically what he does is he's trying to figure out what influences people to eat more or to eat less. So, for instance, he'll go to a restaurant, but not just any restaurant, a test restaurant that's used by the restaurant school at Cornell. So it's designed for people to do experiments, usually experiments in management. And half of the room will hear one type of music, and the other half of the room will hear another type of music. And then they measure how much does the music affect how much food you order. And it actually has an effect. Or how much will you spend? Or what happens if you have empty plates, and so on and so forth. And so I just find like the experiments were brilliantly designed, hilariously funny, and very insightful into human behavior. And I think I've covered now the world and psychology and computer stuff, so there's really nothing else left to recommend. So those are my picks.
That last pick is awesome, I have to say. I mean, with, obesity being viewed as kind of a worldwide problem in the developed world, at least, it would be really interesting to see some of the insights as far as why people do what they do. Very cool. So those are some great picks. I'll move along to my picks now. I usually have a beer pick because I like craft beer, for better or for worse. And I just encountered a local beer, or comparatively local. I live in the Boston area, and so this is from Spencer, Massachusetts, town closer, more around Worcester County where I grew up. Spencer Trappist Ale. The Trappist monks there brew a really nice Belgian beer. And a lot of the time I find that American breweries trying to do Belgian-style beers, kind of with a few exceptions, fall flat in their face, because the thing that makes Belgian beers kind of amazing is that they have this incredible sort of depth and fruitiness and real complexity. Like, it comes from the yeasts in those breweries being, breeding in captivity for generation after generation, creating these just awesome flavors. And the Trappists have kind of nailed it with this. It's one of my favorite domestic Belgian-style ales, and I highly recommend it. So as far as technical picks, as I mentioned, Reuven inspired me to pick Rich Hickey's talk, The Value of Values. And this was a keynote for, I think, either a closure or a JVM conference, where he basically talks about how so many of basically all of our current programming languages were designed around this place-based programming paradigm. It was a memory saving technique where you had this place, it was a variable, and you permuted the state of that variable to make various things happen. But in the modern era where we have gigabytes of memory, there's just kind of no point to that model anymore. And there's a new model that can really change the way you think about solving problems and make your life dramatically easier. So I love that talk. I recommend it highly. The next pick is a Vim plugin. My Vim is my editor of choice, at least for now. I like it quite a bit.
I thought I liked you guys, boy.
Tobias uses Emacs. You're all good. We have an Emacs lover in our midst. And I used Emacs for years. I got to the point where this shows how old I am. Back at the time, we had old pre-Intel Unix class workstations with very limited, amounts of memory and disk allocated per user. And I just got to the point where waiting for Emacs to load was just like, I feel like I'm spending years of my life, which is really silly now because, in our modern machines, there's absolutely no, Emacs comes up poof, no problem at all. But by that point, I had switched to Vim, and my brain kind of works in Vim. But UCompleteMe is a really neat editor for doing auto-completion, syntax-based and otherwise. And it's written in C++, which is kind of nice, as opposed to some of the others which are written in higher level languages like Lua or and the like. So it's pretty snappy, and it does the job. Building it and installing it is a bit of a pain, but it's worth the exercise to get there, at least in my limited experience.
It's actually written in Python, and the compilation step is actually just for the C and C++ bindings for it.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, very cool. Well, it's pretty snappy in any case. Thank you, Tobias. Tobias actually recommended this to me earlier, so I was kind of passing that along. And my last pick is something, because I'm mostly a Mac guy. I do most of my day-to-day work on Linux servers, but I love having a Mac as my primary desktop environment. There's this awesome little tool called SizeUp that lets you sort of assign. It basically lets you manipulate OS X windows in any way you can possibly, imagine, flipping them from monitor to monitor, adjusting their size and position, et cetera, all with a keystroke. And for me, I'm partially blind, and mice are like anathema to me. Like if I have to touch the mouse, my productivity takes a significant nosedive. So having a small tool like this, and it is commercial, but it costs some really small amount of money. I forget exactly what. Is huge, because I can really sort of like drive my environment like a Corvette, as opposed to flailing around with the mouse like a really hapless person that I am. So I think that's about it for picks from me. Tobias, how about yours?
So harking back to the theme of practicing and using practice as a way to really learn a language, there's a really great web-based environment called Check.io that is a somewhat gamified way of performing a number of different practice problems. So it's got a really nice visual aspect to it, and there are different islands, and each island has a different sort of a theme to it. And each of the problems has a little bit of a story blurb to go with it that presents the particular problem that you're trying to solve using Python. And one of the things that really makes it great is that once you've submitted a solution, you can put it up for review, and other people in the community can post reviews on your code to either congratulate you on a job well done, or to give you tips on different ways that you could have achieved the same result. And you can also look at other people's submissions so that you can learn that way. You're all solving the same problem, and you can get an idea as to the different ways people are approaching it. So it's really interesting. Guido actually occasionally pops in and provides some reviews of people's codes. So.
Oh my god, that sounds terrifying.
It's a cool little tool. I haven't had as much time to use it recently as I would like, but definitely worth a look, particularly for people who are looking for a way to get some practice in the language, but don't necessarily have a project that they're working on with it. My next pick is, I guess you could kind of call it a toy, but it's something called Snap Circuits, and what it is a way to introduce people to the world of electronics. So rather than having to have a soldering gun and a bunch of spools of wire to build different circuits, it uses snaps just like you would find on your clothing, and it's got a grid-based board that the different components snap onto, and then they snap to each other to form the actual circuit. So it has batteries, and then it'll have photoresistors and regular resistors and DC motors and all kinds of different components. And one of the things that's really great about it is that you can actually start with a really small base kit just to get a feel of if it's something that'll work for you or your kids. I actually got it from my older son. And then they have expansion kits, so you can, rather than having to go out and buy the big kit all in one, spend the extra money, you can actually just get an expansion kit that'll turn your small kit into the bigger one. So it's a really great idea, really great execution, and then it also comes with a project booklet of different circuits that you can use and teaches you about why it works the way it does. For my next pick, I recently got a new Android tablet, and I spent a little while researching it, trying to figure out which one to get. I ended up going for the NVIDIA Shield tablet. So it's marketed as a gaming tablet, but I don't use it as such. It's just a really powerful, really great tablet, 8-inch. It comes with a built-in stylus, which is really useful for taking down quick notes where I would otherwise pull out a notepad and a pen. It's powerful. It's got 2 gigs of RAM and some crazy number of cores with a NVIDIA GPU built into it. It's got a great screen, and for all that, it's actually a really affordable price. And then the other pick that I'm going to choose is the Samson Go mic, which is what I actually have been using to record these episodes. It's really nice, well-designed microphone, very small and compact, easy to transport, And one of the really nice things is that if you get one of the USB on-the-go adapters, you can actually plug the microphone into your tablet and have a portable recording studio. And my last pick, we recently signed up for something called Zoho Apps, which is sort of a competitor to Google Apps, but it has a free tier as well as a number of paid tiers, and it has a really pretty impressive suite of different products that you can use along with it. Most recently, I was poking around and found out that they actually have a password vault that you can use for sharing credentials between different people in an organization. It has mail, docs, calendar, and overall, it seems to be really well executed. So,
yeah, I'm pretty impressed with that one as well. Actually, Tobias prodded me into switching to it from the Goog for our show notes and for our internal documents and the like. And I'm pretty impressed thus far. It's pretty well put together.
All right. So, Reuven, we want to thank you very much for taking the time to join us and speak with us today. And for anybody who would like to follow you or find out more about what you're up to, what would be the best way to find you or contact you?
So my website, lerner.co.il. From there, you can get to my blog, which is at blog.lerner.co.il, strangely enough. I'm on Twitter as at Reuven M. Lerner. And so basically everything I do sort of publicly, whether it's webinars, books, announcements, blog posts, either my blog or my Twitter feed or both will have them. And I'd be delighted to hear from people. Email, Twitter, you name it. I'm always delighted to hear from people who have questions or comments or just want to get in touch and say hi.
Great. Well,
yes, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, Reuven. It's been really great.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on, and good luck with the podcast. I know it's relatively new, but hopefully it'll be a big success.
Thank you. We're hoping so as well.